Welcome to Saturday's Warrior, the channel where we talk all things BYU and Big 12, but we also talk conference realignment, especially as we are getting into the off season here. We are bringing on a number of guests from the ACC so we can take a deeper dive into their perspective on realignment and how they see things shaking out, which is why with me today I've got Brian from Clemson Football Live joining us. Welcome, Brian.
Trevor, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you reaching out to me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And so we actually are both going to be part of something that is going to roll out here in the next week or so. So please keep an eye out for any announcements on that. And I'll obviously put Brian's all of his information in the show notes so you can look him up after the show as well. But so Brian, conference realignment is all the rage these days. Everyone's, it's been moving at a breakneck pace here as we every change seems to, before I feel like back in the day you'd hear of one thing and then it'd be months, years, whatever before the next real wave would hit. But now it feels like every month, week, day almost there's something new. So with Clemson recently came out or announced that they are going to, or that they're also suing the ACC along with Florida State. So can you give us just a quick high-level summary on what that lawsuit is and what sets it apart from what Florida State is doing?
I'll try my very best to do that because there's a lot of moving parts. And like I've said on my show, I'm not a lawyer, and a lot of the people who are talking about this subject, they're not lawyers either. So I will probably miss some pertinent details, but I'll try to give you, as you said, a high-level summary of this. So Florida State filed their lawsuit, I want to say sometime in December. And the idea, and I can read you from their lawsuit, they're charging different counts of I won't say negligence, but they're saying that the ACC punishments are unenforceable under Florida law as unreasonable restraint. What does that mean? Well, the ACC is demanding for Florida State to, and any member of the ACC to get out of the contract, that they have to pay $140 million plus to get out of the ACC for a contract that will not expire until about 2036, if my memory serves me correct. So Florida State was really upset about that. And you're like, okay, well, what really brought this on? What really brought this on is when the ACC member schools actually saw the contract between ESPN and like the SEC versus ESPN and the ACC. They also saw the money that the Big Ten schools will actually receive during their contract for their TV rights, and it is a sizable difference, and that's what really drove the annoyance with the lawsuit. Now, I will just kind of pause here and say there's also what kind of pushed this into play for Florida State and other schools is how the former commissioner of the ACC handled things. John Swofford cut a deal with his son, who was part of another network that was worth millions of dollars, just to basically, some people say, just to try to save the network. So there's also the thought, if you look on comment boards, especially within ACC teams and people who are really invested in this issue, they're saying that John Swofford was trying to leave a legacy that the ACC is intact for a very long time, no matter what the cost is. I won't make a comment on that. I do know that when you have someone at one entity doing business with a family member at another entity, and it serves that other family member very well, and then you look at how bad this deal has went down with ESPN, you can't help but just go, this just doesn't seem right. So Florida State they will openly talk about Swafford. They'll openly talk about their disdain for him. They'll openly talk about their disdain for their former AD, who now, if my memory serves me correct, and anybody in the comment section correct me if I'm wrong, he now works for the NCAA, and it's a really bad situation. Let's put it that way. So Florida State said, "Look, we're tired of this. We want out. We're in the heart of SEC country. We want out." Well, Clemson started to pursue some legal action and then backed off. And then a few weeks ago, they actually filed a lawsuit here in the state of South Carolina. And basically how they differ from Florida State is that Clemson wants the court to rule that the ACC has no broadcasting rights of their games if they were to leave the league. And also they're contesting the high exit fee, because if you go and you look at the exit fee for, say, a Big Ten school, if I want to say there's no withdrawal penalty. For the Big 12, it's a very small fee. For the SEC, if there's a 2 years notice provided, it's $30 million. If it's less than 2 years notice, it's $40 million. And if there's no notice, you have to pay $45 million and you're out. So both of these schools are suing, saying, first of all, none of this makes sense of why you want to charge us so much as a penalty to leave. So they're pushing that. They're pushing that topic. And to add insult to injury, as Florida State pushed forward with their lawsuit, they found out that there's a date set between the ACC and ESPN that if ESPN wants to renegotiate the contract and opt out, there's a date set for February 2025, which no member school had a clue existed. So as these schools like Clemson dives into this lawsuit, and there's more details coming out, member schools are asking themselves, what else are you hiding? So that's kind of the difference between the Florida State angle versus the Clemson angle. Okay.
And what do you say to, when people are like, this is a raw deal. Like it does suck for these teams, but it was the contract that they signed. And so how do you argue against that? It's like, well, it sucks, but you signed it and agreed to it.
Sure. And that is one of the things that at first was kind of argued. It was almost like you didn't sign the contract. No one's suing saying they didn't sign the contract. Their idea, and by the way, I want to pause there and even interrupt myself. I'm not a fan of people signing contracts and then trying to break them. I think it's unethical. But the idea here is that the ACC is not holding up their end of the contract by looking out for their member schools. So what they're saying, Florida State says that the ACC has materially breached its contract with Florida State by not looking out for their best interest. Now, what I step back and I look at with both of these lawsuits, and the question is, where's North Carolina? North Carolina, there's fighting within Chapel Hill right now. There's a lot of arguing within Chapel Hill. And for those who are watching this video and you really don't know the geographical location of Chapel Hill versus Greensboro, North Carolina, where the head office of the ACC is, unless they moved it. They might have moved it to Charlotte. I take that back. I can't remember. But either way, they're very close. They're all in North Carolina. They're very close. But in Chapel Hill, there is fighting within the administration saying we need to join this lawsuit or an angle of the lawsuit, so we can possibly look out for ourselves. And there's rumors that NC State would have to be part of that deal. NC State is only, 15, 20 minutes from Chapel Hill. Duke, they're all within this small triangle within, 30 minutes of one another. But the idea is that NC State would be part of the deal as well. but the idea across the board, I think I've said idea 50 times there, but the thought across the board is that there's different angles being worked by each of these schools. So if one breaches the angle, all of them get to go with them. So I think Clemson, they were going to make a move, then they stopped, and then they decided to move forward, and everybody, including myself, was like, why did they do that? It's because they were trying to figure out what's our angle. We don't want to go with the same angle as Florida State, because if a judge shuts down that angle, then we have to go back to the drawing board. Mm-hmm. But if each school is working their own angle, somebody might breach the barrier that is grant of rights and this contract, and everybody else will be able to go through. So, I mean, it's a brilliant plan. I'm just kind of wondering when North Carolina is actually going to pull the trigger and join.
Was there something to the timing with Clemson? Was it the fact that the college football playoff came out, or was there, what do you think led to that?
Well, the college football playoff and how much money was divvied up, that definitely had that added even more insult to injury. Because it's just like the ACC has rolled over and played dead. The ACC has lost a lot of respect in the world of college football. I mean, let's step back and take a look at this. The SEC is king when it comes to football. I know the Big Ten just won a national championship with Michigan, but go look at the past 10 plus years. Who's won a national championship? It's been an SEC school or Clemson. And you might have Ohio State, here or there, but it's heavily dominated by not only Southern schools, but the SEC. So Clemson is literally, and Florida State, they're literally in the belly of the SEC, having to watch these schools being treated like kings while Clemson and Florida State are being treated like redheaded stepchildren. And they're wondering, what's our conference doing for us? Why even be part of a conference if they're just going to roll over and go, oh, you want to pay me $10 million less than these teams over here? Okay, that's fine. Really? That's fine? That's okay? And so I really think that majorly impacted Florida State and Clemson. So anyway, I think the timing of the playoff and the money that's paid off, I think it had a lot to do with it as well.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody really questions the motivation behind Florida State and Clemson or any of the other ACC schools that want to get out. We know that that's the way it's going. And any Big 12 school, for example, that would tell you that, oh, I wouldn't go to the SEC right now if they invited me, is lying. Like, anybody would want to get in, because at this point, it really feels like you've got these two behemoths that are going to be making lots of money, and then you're going to have everybody else. And anything that Big 12, ACC, anybody else can do to try to close the gap is going to be minimal at best. And so at this point, everyone's kind of playing for second fiddle to these big guys. So I think that's pretty understandable. And I think for a long time, at least me personally, I remember, I think for a while, it was probably in high school when it finally dawned on me that Clemson was in the ACC and South Carolina was in the SEC or something. I remember when I was like, because I now live in ACC territory, but at the time, I lived actually in Big Ten territory. So I think it took a while before I realized. I was like, oh, that doesn't seem right. Clemson, just always in my mind, felt like an SEC school, even when, they weren't, dominating like they have been the last several years. So we definitely see that. But with, assuming that at some point this grant of rights is broken, that schools are able to get out of the ACC, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of theorizing about where Clemson's going to go. Clemson and Florida State have both been at the forefront of that, even long before these lawsuits, because I think it's been well established that they want to get out of the ACC. In fact, they flirted with going to the Big 12. I don't remember how long ago, at least 10, 15 years ago, they were talking about. It was before this latest grant of rights was signed, because I remember as a BYU fan, it made me really nervous, because I was like, if the Big 12 adds them, they're not going to have, because this was before teams were going to, or conferences were going to these super sizes. But I was like, if they had Florida State and Clemson, their conference isn't going to have any more room for BYU, and that was our best shot of getting in at that point. So I was really happy about the grant of
I bet you
rights.
were.
So, but now BYU's in, but the game has shifted, obviously, and now we're really looking at these two power school conferences. So, again, let's say schools are able to get out, Clemson's there, do you think right now, because Clemson is trying so hard actively to get out of the ACC, do you think that there may be some sort of wink nod agreement kind of behind the scenes that say, hey, we'll bring you into our conference if and when you're able to get out of the ACC?
That's a great question. There are people in the Clemson community who says yes. Do I have definitive knowledge? No. I would lean more towards Clemson finally. The reason that they went into the lawsuit was they finally found an angle, and they were insulted by the college football playoff. But as far as maybe they have an offer on the table, I wouldn't be completely shocked if that happened. You're talking about Clemson and the SEC just a second ago. A lot of people says that Clemson, this is within the ACC, that they're an SEC school in the ACC because especially of their football play, they're really good at baseball, just where they're geographically located. A lot of people really, that they don't realize that Clemson and the University of Georgia are roughly an hour and 20 minutes from one another. In fact, they're the two closest schools to one another. That's a major football power. And so, of course, Clemson, Florida State, why did I say that? Georgia is only about 45 minutes to an hour from Georgia Tech, but Georgia Tech's not a major football power. Clemson is. They're a contender. So these teams should be playing every year anyway, and they're not. They're playing again. They're playing this year. But a lot of people thinks, the SEC would definitely be the landing place for Clemson and Florida State. Sad problem is, like you said, South Carolina is already in the state of South Carolina, University of South Carolina, and there's rumors that they don't want us in whatsoever. They love to talk trash that we're not in the SEC. We're in the SEC, and y'all wouldn't do so great if you were in the SEC. And then we beat them, we laugh, and we go on. It's funny then how they could actually have us in the conference, and the rumor is they don't want us. The other rumor is that Florida doesn't want Florida State in. So I will tell you my thought on it. The overall thought by Clemson fans and people who are just loosely associated with Clemson, maybe an ACC fan, would say Clemson to the SEC, it makes the most sense. And I was on that bandwagon for a long time. It does make sense, With that said, I think that Clemson and Florida State would be more valuable to the Big Ten, and here's why. The Big Ten has a team from sea to shining sea, West Coast, East Coast. I mean, they got them everywhere. Northwest, Southern California. They got them up in Northwest at Washington and Oregon, all the way down to Southern California. You've got a team all the way in the middle of, the middle of the United States, Nebraska, all the way over to Rutgers, right? The only place they don't have a team is in the Southeast, in the backyard of the SEC. And if there's one thing that the Big Ten has done, and they've done very well, is they have truly created a mini super conference that spans nationwide. The SEC, though very powerful, and they have some very important schools in it, adding Texas and Oklahoma this year, that's a big deal. But they don't have that geographical coverage. If the Big Ten were to land Clemson and or Florida State, that would be massive. And just a side note, everyone's scratching their head wondering when North Carolina's going to get involved. Neither the SEC nor the Big Ten has a team in the state of North Carolina. So they're even more attractive than either of our schools when it comes to, you know, a new audience. So there's a lot. Now I'm leaning towards the Big Ten. I would say, hey, I'll take the Big Ten right now. I would go to the Big Ten and be part of this mini super conference that they've created. At this point, I just want to leave the ACC. At this point, after all, and going back to the date set between ESPN and the ACC that no one knew about, and it was kept secret. The question is, what else is kept secret? You can't blame these schools going, hey, you're supposed to look out for us. That's part of the contract. You're supposed to look out for us because we are your member schools. You're not doing that. It just keeps getting worse. So at this point, I would take either or, but I'm leaning towards the Big Ten. But most Clemson fans would tell me I'm crazy and they want to be in the SEC.
So a couple things in terms of South Carolina, not wanting Clemson to join the SEC. That could get in the way. I mean, obviously A&M didn't want Texas to join, and they invited Texas anyway. So I think some of it would be, if it makes sense, I feel like the SEC will go ahead and do it. From what I understand, it's kind of a gentleman's agreement, not so much in the bylaws or anything, that they can't invite new schools from states where they have existing members. So I don't think there's anything limiting them other than the politics behind it. Now, if Florida throws a fit, they might listen about Florida State. I don't know. But if South Carolina throws a fit, I don't know if I can see them having enough clout to, if the rest of the SEC wants it and it makes sense for them. I don't know. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but it does feel like, if the SEC wants them, that, they'll be like, sorry, South Carolina, this hurts your feelings, but we're going to move forward with this. So, yeah, looking at it. So Clemson. So, I mean, the SEC, we've established, I think everybody agrees. It feels like an SEC school, makes sense in so many ways. The only downside I could say, aside from, sharing the state with South Carolina, is more that it's not expanding the territory. You mentioned North Carolina, where that gets would get the SEC into new states. And so does the value that Clemson bring outweigh, doubling up on that territory, missing out on opportunity to expand the footprint? Although, on the other hand, we have the Big Ten, where Clemson doesn't really fit the academic profile as well. Now, they've shown that they're willing to look past that for the right brands. Like Oregon is technically AAU, but they're really on the lower end of that and not, your typical AAU member. But they've got a big brand. Nebraska lost its AAU status before it even officially joined the Big Ten. So that's also not a hard and fast rule. But I think there is something they're looking for in terms of, research universities and things along those lines. And so Clemson doesn't fit that as well, but it does expand the conference's footprint, as you mentioned, into the SEC territory, because I don't know if South Carolina in and of itself is, a target market for the Big Ten, but I think that general geographic area, I think the Big Ten would love to get into. So, there's pros and cons either way. You can argue for and against Clemson joining either conference. I do think, at the end of the day, the conferences will also do what makes most sense for them. My question, though, is, so Clemson, do they have the staying power? It feels like all this is happening maybe a couple years out of Clemson's football prime. Not saying that you can't come back and start competing for championships again, but there has been a little decline, and there is talk about, Dabo not really embracing a lot of these changes in college football. And so you have to wonder, is there staying power with Clemson, or is Clemson going to revert to how they were, 15 years ago or however long ago it was, when they were kind of more at the bottom of the ACC? And if that happens, since we know realignment is driven by football, does Clemson then, if that starts going, declining a little, does that undermine the argument that Clemson, hey, needs to be, in one of these power conferences? And if that happens before Clemson's able to get out of the ACC, at that point, are you looking at a scenario where, maybe the Big 12 is more likely than one of these Power Two?
That is an incredible question. Other Clemson YouTubers and Clemson media outlets who eat, sleep, breathe orange and white, they would be offended by what you just asked. I'm not, because Clemson football is not as dominant as it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you played Clemson, you got your head ripped off. You play Clemson now, you're going to play a world-class defense and an offense who has no identity. And just pause there for a second, because I know we're talking about realignment and so on. The reason that happened was because Sweeney hired a bunch of first-time coaches on his offensive staff. Not one, not two, a bunch of them. And he has since fired his offensive line coach, who played at Clemson, who only had 2 years of coaching experience under his belt. Fired him and replaced him with Matt Luke, who is arguably the best offensive line coach in the country. And he already has the number 2 recruit overall in the 2025 season. I believe it's the 2025 recruiting cycle. Possibly, it's already being crystal balled to us, and you know that's not guaranteed. But what really hurt Clemson football was hiring a bunch of first-year coaches. We have 2 guys never coached a day in their life. They're a wide receiver coach and they're a running backs coach because they played at Clemson. They played in the NFL. So a lot of times you hear the transfer portal and Dabo's lack of wanting to use the transfer portal. That's what's killing them. If that were the case, our defense would be terrible. Our defense is elite. We still have great defensive players. We signed the number 5 overall or number 6 overall player in Sammy Brown, and this past recruiting cycle. Our defense is unbelievable. It's poor coaching development on the offensive side of the ball. That's why we look anemic. And if our defense does poorly, it's because our offenses went out there and played like a recreation team and lost. Or came off the field with nothing, put our defense in a bad position, and after a while they just get tired because they're human beings. Hopefully that's turning around. I think this turnaround is going to be slower for us because I think there's at least one more coach that's probably going to go. I think that most likely that's going to happen. And I think Sweeney didn't fire him this year because of just the poor state of the offensive line at the time and how it affects the wide receivers. We'll see about that. How that circles into what you initially asked me. This is a very dangerous time for Clemson because had this came up during the Trevor Lawrence, Deshaun Watson days, oh man, I would not be shocked if the Big Ten said, hey, look, we'll foot the bill. We'll foot the bill just to get you in. We're thinking long-term, $150 million, $200 million is a lot of money to you and I, but to us, but to them, excuse me, to the Big Ten, $200 million over several years is chump change. It's nothing if they're trying to build the super conference, right? And especially to plant a flag in Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner's backyard, to say, hey, Greg, we're here. Greg, you don't have a team in California. You don't have a team in Utah. You don't have any of those. We have teams in California, in Oregon, in Washington, in Nebraska. Now we have them in South Carolina and Florida. You can't get away from us, Greg. You know, that would be powerful. It is a scary place where Clemson is at because if we have another season, even remotely like the 2023 season, yeah, we finished with a 5-game winning streak and went 9-4, beat Notre Dame, blah, 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 blah. That was a weird season. It was terrible. Clemson looked bad except for the defense. I'm not going to lump the defense in there. Defense looked amazing. I think we finished top 10 defense, you know. But this could actually, that's a great point. It could hurt Clemson for years to come based on how the football team is playing now. So I hope they're getting their act together.
Well, we will see. Time will tell. So let's say, again, Clemson gets out. They get an invite, let's say either conference. but how they like to do things in pairs these days with realignment. Who would you like to have be Clemson's travel partner?
Um, I definitely take Florida State. One thing that I can tell you about Clemson and Florida State when it comes to playing football, we hate each other. It's just good old fashioned Southern football hate because Florida State came into the ACC in the late '80s, early '90s, and they didn't lose their first ACC game until like 1995 or something. They lost to the Barber twins up at Virginia and old man George Welsh. So they used to beat us like redheaded stepchildren because that's what we became after Danny Ford. Danny Ford was gone. The greatness of the '80s left with him. We had maybe one decent season in the early '90s, and about the time that we're falling apart, Florida State has become this behemoth. They win the national championships in the '90s. Even when Dabo Swinney took over, we had 1 year we were actually pretty good. And it was like a top 10 matchup. And with Jimbo Fisher and Jameis Winston, they beat us like 52-17 or something in Death Valley. And then everything happened with Jimbo Fisher. Dabo Swinney starts on this, just blowing up, and we return the favor. So what's so funny is when it comes to football, we're talking trash to one another, but we're like, locking arms, band of brothers here to get out of the ACC. So I wouldn't mind Florida State. I think that it would be good. I think it would be interesting to see us two get together because we are the two premier faces of the ACC football landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we're talking basketball, leave us both out of it. You're talking Duke, you're talking North Carolina. I know what NC State's doing right now. I know that's great and wonderful and stuff. We're talking Duke and North Carolina when you talk about the ACC basketball, but we're not. And I think that's also something, kind of a nuance of this whole ACC falling apart thing. In the state of North Carolina, basketball is king. There's no great football team up there. Yes, they might have a good football team here and there and sprinkled in, every now and again. But the truth is, basketball is king in the state of North Carolina. I mean, good grief, Michael Jordan was born and raised there, played there, And so I think that some people in the back of their mind thinks, you know what, the reason that the ACC is not taking care of us is because they don't care about football. And you would think that's crazy because football makes so much money. But anyway, but Florida State would be a great partner to travel with, because you would have you could reminisce over the years past that we played against one another. I wouldn't be against having North Carolina go with us, if Florida State decided to go another route. But I think North Carolina could be a lot of fun to go with them. But that rivalry of Florida State and just the tension, that would be fun.
Yeah, I think the big things driving realignment right now are, geography, brands, but then also rivalries come into play, I think. And maybe not quite as high in the list of those others, but if you can get two brands in new geography that are rivals, I think that's what, I think that also played well for Oregon coming along with Washington instead of bringing a Stanford or somebody that maybe fit better. That Big Ten profile is okay. It is new geography, but it's not like Oregon is going to bring you as big a numbers as the Bay Area. But at the end of the day, Oregon itself is a bigger brand and better. Like we said, it's all driven by football. So those things I think do bode well for Clemson in that regard in terms of realignment and where they may end up. So they may very well have the chance to decide between two conferences. They may get two offers or, may not. I don't know how it'll play out, but I could see it going either way. And I think that's why there's such intense debate about it with people is that there's reasons for and against it either way. So if you had to say right now, the likelihood of where you think Clemson will end up between Big Ten, SEC, staying in the ACC, the Big 12, or something else altogether. How would you break down the likelihood
Oh,
of each of those?
that's the $1 billion question, literally, probably over time between these schools and everything that's involved there. Um, Obviously, it's not out of the question that Clemson and Florida State are stuck. In fact, that's the heavier possibility. What you're really gambling, risking, hoping for is that one of these schools, and we need more schools to join this lawsuit. By the way, 4 of the top law schools in the nation are in the ACC: Duke, Virginia, UNC, Wake Forest. I think Boston College is on the list as well. I might miss someone else. So they need to toss this contract among those law students and their brilliant professors and say, take this sucker apart and figure a way out. But the hope is that you can get in front of a judge that will show some sympathy and say, you know what, it doesn't make sense that this organization's not acting in its members' best interest, and then want to basically have the team have to sell their stadium to get out of the out of the contract. But I mean, that's a great possibility. I don't think that Clemson would have entered this lawsuit unless they felt confident. They did drag their feet to a point that annoyed me. But with that said, there's a good possibility that this is going nowhere. I think that if they can get out, and by the way, the AAU requirement, I have been told now by multiple people that the Big Ten will waive it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said that a long time ago, and people were like, no, it's a requirement. And I was like, look, yo, we're talking about tons of money here. They're not going to let some little academic requirement
Oh, I
stand in
don't
the way
know.
of tons
I
of
don't
money.
know if the AAU stamp, on there is
Right.
necessarily going to be in the way. What I would think is, if you listen to, and Big 12 fans despise this man, but like people like Tony Altomore, I don't know if you've come across his stuff, but talking about, and he's using his charts and diagrams and all these things, talking about how there's fit. And different cultural things and all these other things outside of what we see on the field that come into play behind the scenes for the administrators, and that might argue how Clemson doesn't necessarily fit that Big Ten profile based on all these other, criteria that they've, plotted and everything on these graphs for us. So, if there's truth to that, and if that's behind the scenes and these people say, hey, you know what, we got to do business with these people, and for whatever reason, they don't match they're not aligned with us on a lot of different things, because really we're more focused on research or whatever, and we're, aligning ourselves with Clemson. I don't know,
Right.
whatever, the elitist mentality is or whatever. I don't know behind the scenes, but I imagine that's real, versus the, dollars and cents that we're saying, hey, football, this is how much value we think Clemson could add. And so that would be the fine line, is what the
Sure.
administrators behind the scenes, these people that aren't necessarily just making football decisions, what they're looking at. And obviously I can't tell you where they come down on that, or even begin to pretend, but I think that could be something. But I think as far as just like AAU, I don't think that alone is going to be enough to keep Clemson out of the Big Ten. It's, it would be much more political than that, I think.
I agree. I think that this is a major football deal, and the the Big Ten has done a great job on leading the way of creating the mini super conference. And I'm shocked at how well they've done. So that could play in our favor. Where my heart would like to see us at this point, I would like to see us in the Big Ten. At first, that was just weird saying that. I was just like, ugh, I feel like I need a shower. No, I've the more and more I've thought about it, I like it. I like it. You're. I don't know. I won't dive into that. The SEC is definitely a possibility. the Big 12 would be kind of a shock to me. The Big 12 would be kind of a shock to me. But then again, I mean, take a look at the Big 12. They've expanded into various parts of the country. So I lean towards that if we do leave, maybe something will be struck with the Big Ten just to be a pain in the butt of the SEC. Because one thing about Clemson pulls a lot of players that would normally go to Georgia. Georgia's still very upset. And even the University of Tennessee, because Trevor Lawrence loved the University of Tennessee, but that's when Knoxville was on fire when he was in high school and being recruited, and so both of those schools really despise Clemson for pulling Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson because they literally drove over the state line and got them, and it's like, are you serious? Two of the most well-known, most powerful, game-changing quarterbacks that the recent college football game has seen couldn't be retained by either school, but in-state school, that is. But they both ended up at Clemson. So it would be definitely an insult, I think, to them, and there's just some interesting nuances there. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah. So can I get you to put a number on it? Where you think the likelihood of each of these scenarios? Are you going to politician yourself out of it?
Oh my goodness. I will politician my way out of it. I feel like I need to take a shower again. You know what? I'll try to take a wild guess. I think we're looking about 60% that there's no way they get out of this. They get out of this deal.
Really?
60%. I think that's right off the top of my head. You started to make me itch. I'm having to think about this. I'm scratching my eyes. I'm wiggling. It's like, what's wrong with him?
First time.
No. I'll say 50. I'll take that back. I'll say 50% they get out of it. I think there's a 50-50 chance because they wouldn't have. I'll politician my way out of this. 50% say that they get out of it. 50% that they don't. If they do get out of it, no inside intel. I think they land in the Big Ten just to be a pain in the SEC's butt because the SEC has said they haven't said it, but they've majorly implied or seem to have implied they really don't want either one of our schools. And if they did, they'd want Florida State. So
yeah. Well, your guess is as good as anybody's. I think it's just it's been a wild ride. I mean, nobody would have ever guessed USC and UCLA to the Big Ten. No. So I think we're all just in just waiting to see and knowing that the college football landscape is changed forever and it's going to continue to change, and just hope, everyone's just hoping for the best for their own school at this point because nobody knows what to expect anymore. So
right.
The fact that Clemson to the Big Ten is just as likely a possibility as anything at this point, it goes to show. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you hopping on with me. This has been it's been a lot of fun. It's been informative, and really enjoyed talking with you and hearing your perspective on all this. Why don't you tell everyone where they can find you on social media and everywhere, on YouTube?
Sure. Again, thanks for having me on, Trevor. You can find me at Clemson Football Live on YouTube, Clemson Football Live, and I go live. Sometimes I go live every day. Sometimes I go live every, maybe once per week. It's according to what's going on in football. But yeah, stop by and drop me a comment and let me know that you saw me on this channel. And Trevor, again, thanks for having me on, and hopefully I offered a little bit of insight into this crazy, it's like a soap opera just with football teams.
That's the best description of it I've heard. Yeah, absolutely. It is a soap opera, and we're all here on pins and needles waiting to see what happens next. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm going to continue doing this series, going throughout, having other guests on from representing different fan bases across the ACC to get their perspective on what's happening. So if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel so you can catch all those, and certainly go follow Brian and check out all his content, especially if you're a Clemson fan. Go support him and watch his content. And as always, go Cougs.